kick that off and then we'll fire you up again. All right, I think we're good to go. Floor is yours, Birgit.
Great. So I manage the Association of Enterprise Architects, and I'm delighted to announce that last month we actually launched an Open Badges program. Digital badges. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Open Badges or have used them, but we're pretty excited about it. So what are digital badges? They're web-enabled versions of a credential, certification, or learning outcome. It's really a PNG file that contains metadata or information on that credential or that certification or that learning outcome. So we've partnered with Acclaim, who Oracle and IBM use as well. So their badging platform is actually backed by Pearson. And so what they're doing is they're translating those learning outcomes that you've demonstrated into a digital badge. And so the first few badges that we launched last month, just to kind of get started and to kind of, put a stake in the ground, was for conference attendee, conference speaker, and the next two that I'm really happy to share with you that we're going to be launching is one for chapter officers and also another one for authors for the Journal of Enterprise Architecture. So anyone submitting, articles to the journal, they will earn a digital badge. So when you start collecting these digital badges, you can actually share with other folks what you've been doing. You can share via LinkedIn, via Twitter. You can put them on your signature and your email. And it really paints a better picture of who you are and what you've been doing, and and really what you're capable of. And so it shows your employers or prospective employers or your colleagues, what you've been doing in your career and the things that and whether a certification or a learning outcome, all these things that you've been accumulating over the years. And these digital badges can actually be displayed in what they call a digital wallet or a digital backpack. And so our hope is that we're going to be building more of these, issuing more of these badges for various programs. We're looking at the Open CA certification program and also downstream probably TOGAF. And folks, we got really, really great feedback when we launched last month, and Mike can speak for it. He went through the process. It's really pretty easy. You get an email from Acclaim, which has been verified that you earned this credential. You click on the link and you claim your badge, and then you can display that badge, wherever you want. So I don't know if anyone had any questions for me, or Mike, you wanted to talk about it since you went through the process. I'd be happy to take questions afterwards. If anyone wants to email me, I can actually, I'll type my email here.
Yeah, so while Birgit's typing her email, I can tell you that having been through the process at the recent Open Group San Francisco meeting, it's very simple. It took me just about 2 minutes to go through the entire process beginning to end and get my my two different badges. I got an attendance badge and a speaker badge, and it was very simple, very easy to use. I can tell you I've done a little bit of sharing that out. I was able to share my badge out on LinkedIn very easily as well. I haven't quite figured out everything that I can possibly do with it yet, but I'm sure over time I'll continue to learn more and see more opportunities to take advantage of that. But I think it's a good start, and like I said, very simple, very easy to use. So I definitely recommend it to folks. Birgit, are you planning on making these available for AEA chapter meeting attendance or for the IT for IT certification? Those would be the two questions I had.
Yeah, those are great questions, Mike. And in fact, I'm here in the office with Dave Lounsbury, and we just said that, yeah, we should be doing that for IT. So I'd say watch that space. As far as for chapter attendees, I think that's something, we should discuss. I'd like to discuss that with you and some of the other chapter officers. We're definitely, in the next couple of weeks, you're going to be seeing, the badge for chapter officers and also the one for authors. So if you're submitting an article to the Journal of Enterprise Architecture, or even if you submit, and write a blog on the AEA website, we will be issuing a badge for that.
Great.
So,
Any other questions? Any other questions for Birgit?
I'm just curious, if everyone who's here, are folks using digital badges?
If you are using digital badges, if you could throw that in the chat.
That'd be great, yeah.
John, I noticed you unmuted. Did you want to jump in for something there?
Yeah, right before you said everybody put it in the text.
That's all right. Go ahead.
So, well, what I was going to ask is, well, I am not a user of badges. This sounds intriguing. But in general, I share information with a broad community of people, and I do that by updating either my resume or my LinkedIn profile and some other social media things. Can you talk about how, in a professional community, badges might be integrated with something like that?
It is. In fact, you can share. So Acclaim works directly with LinkedIn, so you can share your badge via your LinkedIn profile, and it gets listed there, as Mike had said. What these digital badges do, since each one of them contains this metadata or info on various things you've done, even more so than I think what you write up in LinkedIn. And it's, their visual image, which will, IBM uses a lot of these for a lot of their different, certifications and trainings, and it'll have a visual image, and I'll say like, author or contributor or, a specific certification, and then when someone clicks on that badge, it'll actually give them much more information on how you actually earn that credential.
Inside the badge.
Inside the badge, that's right. So people are collecting these, in a series, and they're painting a much better picture of who that person is, because there may be various things that you're doing, and people don't realize what it really took to earn that credential or that certification.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Thank you.
Very good.
Good question.
All right. Well, unless there are any other questions, which I don't see any on the chat at this time, I'd like to thank Birgit for stopping by and giving us a quick update on that, and I urge you to watch for more information on the opportunity to use digital badges with your profiles. Thanks, Birgit.
Great. Thank you so much for the time, and good luck with your meeting. It sounds like you have some very interesting speakers there tonight. Great. I'll try to stay on for as long as I can, but I'll mute myself. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, so with that, let's unmute our next two speakers. We've got, sorry about that, Bill. I've got Bill and Wendy. So Bill Ulrich is the president of TSG Incorporated, and he is the president and co-founder of the Business Architecture Guild. Bill is a thought leader in the field of business architecture and business transformation. He's an ongoing contributor to the Guide for Business Architecture Body of Knowledge and a co-author of Business Architecture, the Art and Practice of Business Transformation. He's also an author of Information Systems Transformation. He's been an active contributor to the international standards community, serving as an OMG Task Force co-chair since 2003, and he's a Cutter Consortium Fellow. As a management consultant for more than 30 years, Mr. Ulrich continues to serve in the role of senior advisor, mentor, and workshop leader to corporations and government agencies across a wide number of industries focused on helping businesses address major transformational challenges. Bill will be co-speaking this evening with Whynde Kuehn. Sorry, Wendy. Wendy is the principal of S2C Consulting, which is a consulting firm accelerating successful business transformations with a focus on Fortune 500 companies. Wendy is a longtime business architecture practitioner, educator, and industry thought leader. She's a former practice leader and has developed business architecture with some of the largest business transformations in the world. She has extensive experience helping clients build their own business architecture practices and mentoring those practices towards maturity. She's a co-founder, board member, and editorial board chair of the Business Architecture Guild. She is passionate about using business as a force for good and challenge systematic change. Whynde is also a co-founder of Metanoia Global, hopefully I pronounced that right, an organization that helps social entrepreneurs start, scale, and sustain successful businesses. So with that, I'm excited to welcome Bill and Whynde to the stage, and we'll turn it over to you guys.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, I was muted there for a second. Well, thank you again for the warm welcome. Bill and I are really excited to be here on behalf of the Guild and have the opportunity to share with you all. So within this part of the program, we're going to be covering a very brief overview of business architecture, or Business Architecture 101. So if we go to the next slide, we'll look at our discussion topics here tonight. We'll first start with what is business architecture, what value does it provide, what are the key domains, and what is the business architecture framework. We'll look at how business architecture helps move strategy into actionable solutions, very important role, as well as business architecture's role in IT architecture and IT solution deployment. And then we'll wrap up by dispelling 10 common myths of business architecture and giving you some ideas for more information. So that's the plan, and we'll get started. Next slide. So we'll start here by defining business architecture. So formally defined, it's a blueprint of an enterprise that provides a common understanding of the organization and is used to align strategic objectives and tactical demands. So just to break that down a bit into a few key points. First, business architecture is a blueprint. And as you'll see shortly, that blueprint is made up of multiple different domains, which give us different views into the business. Second, business architecture provides us with a common understanding of the organization. It gives people a common language and a common framework, so they all have the same mental model when they think about how the business is structured, what it does, and what it needs to do to meet its goals. And then finally, business architecture is used to align strategic objectives and tactical demands. So what we say is business architecture is a very important bridge between strategy and execution. Next slide, please. So I'd like to introduce this concept of a business ecosystem. And this concept is really all around us now, and it's becoming more and more important as business gets more creative and more global. And a business ecosystem is really the idea that one or more legal entities, part or whole of them, can come together and interact cohesively for mutual benefit and towards some sort of common mission or purpose. So when you think about business architecture, don't just think about within the bounds of an enterprise, but it really delivers horizontal and vertical business ecosystem transparency, which can cross multiple entities, that is focused on driving actionable results out of business strategy. So as you're going to see in the next slide as well, at its core, business architecture provides a representation of what a business does, that's capability, how it delivers value to internal and external stakeholders, those are value streams, the very vocabulary and the words that we use to communicate, that's business information, and then the business structure or the organization. And then we supplement these 4 core domains, which we call them, or representations, with extended domains that give us additional context and information, including things like strategy, stakeholders, initiatives, products and services, policies, decisions and events, and analytics. And so on the next slide here, you'll see a visual that shows what I was just describing. So in the center circle there, in the yellow circle, you see our 4 core business architecture domains: capability, value stream, organization, and information. And then around the outer circle, you see the extended domains like strategy and stakeholders and products and so on. Each of these domains answers different questions. Some answer, what do we do? Some answer, who does it? How do we do it? When do we do it? Where do we do it? And when you take all of these domains and relate them to each other, then you really harness the power of business architecture because we can analyze the business from so many different perspectives at a high level. So this particular diagram here is a really important one. You'll see it in multiple places from the Guild. And the other thing that's very valuable about this is it really shows what business architecture is and what it isn't. Next slide. So why business architecture? Why leverage business architecture? Well, some common business issues that we see are lack of a customer or a stakeholder perspective. That's a pretty common challenge. So organizations are often focused from the inside out versus the outside in, and they've been able to do that for decades, really just take an operational perspective versus a customer perspective. No shared understanding of business capabilities or a shared vocabulary, so everybody uses different words for the same thing, or we might use the same word like customer or product, but we have different ideas in our mind about what that means. Business unit silos have become very common as organizations have gone through mergers and acquisitions and have grown and changed over time, and that can make it very challenging to deliver a consistent and integrated customer experience. And then there's just an overall lack of transparency across business units, especially when they're particularly siloed. So these common issues then translate into business challenges like innovation and planning teams lacking critical perspectives. So in particular, we see the customer perspective or the value perspective is often missing in these teams, or a cross-business unit perspective is missing. Inability to trace strategy through initiatives and solutions to really understand why we're delivering something in the first place and what, how it's going to impact our strategy and results. Investment decisions can be risky and ill-informed, and by investment that could be anything from an initiative to something like a merger or acquisition. Siloed initiatives are often misdirected or in conflict, so we see things like initiatives creating duplicate work or even working at cross purposes with each other. Requirement scope is unclear, leading to failed projects. Ineffective cross-business unit coordination creates risks and drives up costs, such as through business and IT duplication, as I mentioned. And then IT investments can be ill-conceived and not truly tied back to the strategy, and even potentially lacking a clear return on investment. So these are the issues, and these are the challenges which probably some of you can relate to in organizations that you've seen. And if we go to the next slide, we see that business architecture can be a tremendous help for these things. It is especially powerful for the challenges that need to be solved with an enterprise cross-business unit perspective. That's what business architecture does really good, among other things. It facilitates issue analysis, solution definition, and scoping through delivery of shared insights that enable strategic planning, product design, and customer experience teams. It allows us to innovate our business model and actually understand if we change the business model, what parts of the business need to change, how does that change ripple through the organization. It helps us to enable strategy deployment and initiative definition. It helps us to maximize customer experience and value delivery. Helps us to streamline external and internal stakeholder engagement. Helps us to articulate case management and other downstream designs and solutions. Helps us to frame and articulate business requirements, giving them a reusable framework to tie back to so we don't have to recreate them every time. It allows us to frame IT architecture transformation and solution to deployment, so Bill's going to talk about that a little bit later on here. And it helps us to articulate and frame solutions for a myriad of business scenarios. Obviously we're going through this quickly here tonight, but we could talk really at length about how business architecture helps in any of these scenarios. And I think it's important to note that business architecture is not necessarily an end in itself. It's not just about creating a bunch of maps and views of the business. The heart is really how you use those maps and how, as I've described here, how you use them to frame the business and frame these scenarios, analyze and communicate information. And of course, you can also imagine with the breadth of things that business architecture can help with, there's a lot of integration needed with other teams upstream and downstream, like strategy teams, planning teams, business analysis, BPM, goes without saying, IT architecture, of course. And we typically define all these relationships in an engagement model and build them over time. So that's the value of business architecture. And then on the next slide here, let's talk a bit more about how business architecture drives us to actionable results. As I mentioned before, business architecture is really that bridge between strategy and execution, and what an exciting and important job that is. So if you look on the left-hand side here, we have business strategy, which gets reflected through things like mission and vision, policy, goals and objectives, customer requirements, and various strategy and tactic documentation at enterprise level, business unit level, and other ones as needed. And so there's typically a gap here between how do you take those big ideas and move them into action, and not only move them into action, do it in a coordinated way. So, different product lines and different business units aren't working but needing to do that in their own silos. So what business architecture allows us to do is it gives us a way and a framework to say, if this is our strategy, what are the operational changes that need to be made, reflected through capability, value stream, org information, and those extended domains that I walk through. And if these are the changes that we need to make to the architecture, let's bundle them into well-articulated business priorities, business-driven roadmaps, not necessarily IT projects, business view here, high level, collaborative projects and initiatives, business-driven IT architecture transformation strategies, and all of these things, of course, lead to actionable results and coordinated ones across the enterprise, because we're able to take a higher level view. So in summary here, we can connect the desires on the left into actionable results on the right through the lens of business architecture to streamline initiative and solution definition and deployment. So that's, I think, the very basic overview material. Bill, I'm going to turn it over to you at this point.
Okay. Thank you, Wendy. What I want to talk about going forward from this point is a little more of the details behind what Wendy called so far. The first thing I want to do is bring up the business architecture framework. The framework is a broader perspective on what we initially showed you as the core and extended perspectives of business architecture, which are there in the center, as you saw from prior slides. We're bundling these together collectively into something we call our knowledge base. The knowledge base is something that, as you mature your business architecture, you'll need to start to think and consider seriously, because when you have capability map and value streams and a number of these other types of mappings, it's the relationship among those perspectives of the business that provides you with the breadth and depth of transparency into different aspects of the business necessary to deliver value on certain scenarios and so on. So when we look at maturing a business architecture, we have to look at it in the context of how am I going to manage all of this content across multiple business scenarios and business units and different teams that are using the business architecture, all of which need maybe variations on essentially a cross-section of the same information. What do those blueprints look like, and how do I derive that information? So what we want to have is a framework of reference, and a lot of organizations initially might start out with either spreadsheets or even other desktop tools potentially some diagramming tools that they use for business architecture, but to go beyond the simplistic initial stages of business architecture, you'll need to have a more mature perspective. And this type of framework provides you with the backdrop for understanding that, including getting all the way down to how do all these components fit together, what's the depth of detail behind them. The Business Architecture Guild has a meta model team that's actually working out a meta model that's looking to move towards standardization at some point, which would support this framework as well. And you can identify the scenario and decide which types of blueprint perspectives you need, derive those from the knowledge base, and then move forward. Now, what I want to do next is just provide you with a little bit of background on two mappings. One is the capability map, and the second one is the value streams, just because they're so central to what business architecture is. They're not certainly the only things, but they're certainly key components. What you're looking at here is a level 1 capability map that's broken into its 3 standard tiers of customer facing or core, strategic, and supporting. It's a fairly generic map. We'll tell you that most capability maps have a lot more industry-specific capability representations at the centerpiece. Here you're just seeing essentially customer, agreement, product, and partner. So you see a lot more in that middle, because that middle piece is what makes you, as a business, who you are. Moving down from a level 1 perspective, there is this concept of decomposition. And as you decompose each level 1 to level 2, 3, and depending on how far you go and what your purpose is, if you're into some significant transformation work around a particular set of capabilities, certainly deeper than 3, 4, 5, we've even seen it going down to 6 levels, where you're basically breaking down each of the higher level capabilities into more and more detail for detailed planning work, solution analysis, requirements definition, input, and so forth. So we see the capability map, which should be based on a very robust, very formal approach, which is usually driven out of the concept of business objects, working with the business to decouple that so you can have everything you do as a business represented in this map. We like to have that defined for a business in a very consistent, rationalized way. And building out the capability map is one of the more challenging aspects. Once it's done, it's not something you'll do over and over and over again. Wendy and I are working with organizations who established very, very robust capability maps 3, 4, 5 years ago, and that while they do simple maintenance to it periodically or drill certain aspects down more deeply, they're not reworking those maps on a continuous basis. They are established and they are framed as what the business does, not what the tools or the technologies or the systems do, but what the business does, automated or not, and that becomes a very robust framework for everything else that you're doing around business architecture, business IT alignment, and so on. Capabilities should be stable, robust, rarely change in major significant ways. The capability, as we define it here, we use the Holman definition, which was drafted about, 10 years ago now, as a particular ability or capacity that a business may possess or exchange to achieve a specific purpose or outcome. Essentially, capabilities are the glue that connect the other aspects of business architecture as well as IT architecture together. So we did want to show that, just even though we have a fairly short discussion today, just to lay out some basic things around this. The second thing we wanted to provide for you today was the concept of a value stream. As important as capabilities are, we consider value streams to be very essential to a mature and robust business architecture. The value stream provides the stakeholder value perspective for a business. It's an end-to-end view of how value is achieved for a given stakeholder. We're looking at one example here, which is called acquire product. Fairly straightforward. There's certainly more complex value streams, but this is any time a customer comes to you and wants to set up a new. wants to buy a product, anything along those lines, you'd have things along that way. These are called externally facing value streams because they're triggered by somebody from outside the business. You can also have internal value streams such as onboarding and human resource. This particular value stream example, at the end of the value stream, we have a new hired employee. Remembering that value streams striving to achieve the objective or value item, which is at the end of the line there, stated in the name of the value stream for the triggering stakeholder. A quick architectural perspective on value stream, because I believe we'll have some architects who are listening and to this conversation. Value streams, and this is taking off your business person's hat and putting on your architect's hat, they're state-based transition frameworks that enable visualization of how work moves across one or more value streams until the state of certain business objects terminates the value stream. Value streams break down into stages. The stages break down further. We're not going to show that today. And ultimately, you have a very robust state transition framework for managing work movement and state transitions until ultimately the value for the customer or the other stakeholder is achieved. They are not business processes. If you think of them as business processes, you will lose the architectural framing that underpins value streams. We consider processes operational perspectives, not architectural perspectives. So these are two very different things, so you don't want to mix those up. Let me move across now to the IT architecture perspective, because I want to make sure we get that in here today. The IT architecture is considered the representation of how applications and data and all the technology that works against that data and the supporting technology, and we'll look at a little more breakdown in the next slide, are essentially automating the way things work today. If I'm looking at the difference between what business architecture is, which is that upper platform, and what IT architecture is, which is that bottom platform, if I go back 100 or 200 years in time to a company that existed maybe 100 years ago, maybe your company's 100, 150 years old. The U.S. Patent Office is over 200 years old. If we go back in time and look at those businesses, we could have built a business architecture for any of those businesses at that point in time. We would still be using the same representations: value delivery perspectives, stakeholder perspectives, strategy perspectives, capability perspectives, information or vocabulary perspectives, organizational structural perspectives. However, because the concept of IT and computers and automation essentially didn't exist in those days, we would not have an IT architecture. Fast forward to today, and we have the concepts of application architecture, data architecture, and technical architecture. We'll break that down a little bit more on the next slide. What we're seeking to do is to have the IT architecture aligned to and supporting business architecture. So the mature business would have a scenario where there is rapid fusion and integration of change from one perspective to the next, so that a change in the business is reflected quickly and effectively in the IT architecture and redeployed to support the business architecture. That's what we're representing here. Most businesses are not at that point today, and we'll have a long journey to get there. But this provides you the framework not only for incremental alignment, but large-scale transformation to your IT architectures. And business architecture provides a baseline foundation for that. And as somebody who's been in the IT transformation field for decades, I can't even begin to have a conversation about IT transformation without first starting with the conversation of business architecture. Let me just give you one other quick breakdown here, which is the enterprise architecture, where business architecture fits. You saw one view on the last slide. If we break down the enterprise architecture, and this is derived from an upcoming CIO review article that I did with Richard Soley, you can see the reference down there on the right, where the business architecture provides the business insights into the application architecture and the other components, data architecture, technical architecture, and the horizontal view of architecture, which is more initiative or portfolio specific, which we call solution architecture. By the way, this perspective is not something that we came up with out of whole cloth. This is a relatively well accepted view of enterprise architecture where you have these different components where business architecture provides the business perspective and the remaining four pieces provide the IT architecture perspective. Let me just take you to one more perspective here of how Wendy talked at the beginning about how we move from strategy through deployable solutions. All of these parts and pieces connect. We can trace strategy from strategic objectives all the way down through IT assets and solutions. The objectives and the action items out of strategy target value streams and capabilities and initiatives, and that's how I can frame the scope of the impact on my business of a particular strategic objective. Capabilities and value streams, and we're not showing, but the information mapping to the upper right there have a direct relationship and impact on application and data architectures. And we can connect those so we can understand exactly which IT assets would be impacted and need to be either improved or built as part of that strategy. And the overall approach allows traceability of strategic objectives, business perspectives, and investments to IT assets and related impacts. By the way, we can include business requirements in here, and there's a number of other expanded views of this where we can incorporate most of the kinds of concepts that you're using today. We can align business architecture with Agile and a number of other areas. So based on that, let me just hit a few myths, and then we'll open it up to some questions. These are common myths that we find all the time, and we like to dispel them. A business architecture can be built with limited business engagement and commitment. You will maybe be building a business architecture with limited business engagement, but you will not be building a good one. It will not be sustainable, and it will likely fall into the use by a few IT people for maybe some usefulness, but very limited scale, and will not have the reach into the business that you want and need for business architecture to truly deliver large-scale value to your business, changeable value to your business. People think that the capability map is a deliverable. It's not. It's one thing that you do along the way to map out your business architecture. The real deliverables out of business architecture are the ability of business architecture to support all the other aspects and components of the work you're doing. Business architecture in and of itself is complicated. It's not. It's fairly straightforward. Building a capability map takes time because you have to engage subject matter experts. It's not that complicated to build a capability map. It just takes an investment and some rolling up the sleeves and going to work. The same is true for all the other mappings of business architecture and cross-mappings. Another myth is that there's no commonly defined approach. Absolutely not the case. We have people around the world, thousands of people around the world who are Business Architecture Guild members who are using the Business Architecture Guild framework. You've seen a number of the different aspects of that leading up to this point today. There is a commonly defined approach. People say, oh, but there's other approaches. We've seen other approaches. They're not sustainable, they're not robust, and usually they're IT architecture driven and business process driven as opposed to business architecture driven. So while there are some other approaches, they tend not to have the reach and impact that this particular framework has. Business architecture is a program, project, or business unit specific. Absolutely not. It's a business-wide enabling solution or framework that has to be it needs to reach as many people as possible and be engaged as broadly as possible. You can go out and license and buy a business architecture. Rarely, if ever, the case. While we do have industry reference model work going on, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to get anything that's just going to be able to drop into your organization. Business architecture is an IT discipline. The successful business architecture work we see going on today is being done in the business, by the business, for the business. And Wendy and I work with a lot of companies. Those organizations, when they really have a mature business architecture team, typically it's set up outside the IT proper. Although many of those groups or organizations did initiate them inside of IT or enterprise architecture and ultimately move them out. Business architecture is expensive. Another myth. It's not. People think that, oh, I have to do cost justification. Why? It's pennies on the dollar to what you spend every year on IT architecture. IT architecture, by the way, which a Standish group will tell you, much of which is is wasted and goes down the drain and is lost expenditures. Business architecture is not a large expenditure. It's an investment in time by people with knowledge and a handful of people within a group that have to be formed, but it's not a major technology investment or a major large-scale consulting investment. It needs to be built largely in-house with your own folks. Businesses do not need business architecture because they already understand all they need to know about the business. Not true at all. The transparency is very, very weak, especially as you move across business unit silos. And that lack of transparency, Whynde talked about all the issues that created earlier. Business architecture is a fancy term for business analysis. Absolutely false. Business analysis is a unique and separate discipline. Business analysts and business requirements analysis itself is a huge beneficiary of business architecture, and business architecture can be used to frame agile, waterfall, and other requirements analysis techniques and approaches. It in and of itself, though, is unique and separate from business analysis, and if you're trying to build a business architecture from the bottom up using business analysis techniques, I can pretty much tell you that all the organizations we've seen try that have failed. So for more information, we'll give you a couple of reference points here. Whynde and I have a chapter in a book that came out last year. It's called Setting the Record Straight. You can go to this website, which is actually the Business Architecture Guild public resources page, and you can click and download the PDF of that. We have reprints of that for you. A great resource is where we always go for our information, the BizBox Guide, a guide to the business architecture body of knowledge. It is put out by the Business Architecture Guild. You can go to the Business Architecture Guild site. It's a Business Architecture Guild itself is a not-for-profit. You can go there. You can go online. You can find out how to join and get that information. There's new versions put out twice a year with a lot of content update. It is in continuous updating with more than a dozen collaborative teams of members working on it constantly. Every 6 months, that content is packaged up and rolled in. You can also look in the CIO review coming out, I think it's mid to late February, putting business into enterprise architecture. I referenced that earlier. There's a book you can get on Amazon from Neil McWhorter and myself. And then finally, if you really want to find out what's going on, you can look at the Business Architecture Innovation Summit, which is being held in Reston, Virginia, March 15th and 16th. There's a link there, co-sponsored by the Business Architecture Guild and the Object Management Group. It's a great event. It's relatively inexpensive. We always like to get together with people from all over the world, business architects who are coming to tell stories about what they're doing with business architecture, real practitioners from banks, insurance companies, manufacturing companies, and so on. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to our host, Mike, and we'll take any questions.
Great. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Whynde. Wonderful presentation. I appreciate the story you guys have to tell and you taking the time to share it with us. Looks like we do have a couple of questions coming in on the chat for you. The first question I think is for either of you. Should enterprise architects temporarily ignore IT architecture in favor of developing their business architecture?
Whynde, I can jump in on that one.
Sure.
I would never ignore enterprise architecture, but if you have the need for getting a business perspective, then I think what you need to do is to expand your enterprise architecture perspective to incorporate true business architecture, not as a side job by one person who's also saddled down with application architecture and 6 other things, but as a focal point to look at establishing a team and to see where the best place that team should be governed from a business perspective, working with the business to see if you can get some sort of collaborative effort going to start to build out your business architecture. So we would never tell anybody to ignore all the other aspects of enterprise architecture, because I'm a big proponent of enterprise architecture, and the Guild itself is a member of the Federation of Enterprise Architecture Professional Organizations, so we support this enterprise architecture. But we would also tell any enterprise architecture team that whether it's outside the organization or inside, that they should have a focal point on business architecture at some level.
Great.
And Bill, just to echo your points, really hard to do as a side job because there's a lot of relationship building with the business, and sometimes it just requires a different set of skills as well, the person that's going to play the business architect role. So,
very much.
Great, thank you. Got a couple more questions that have come in. Next question is related to the structure of your business architecture team. Do you find that it's more important that within your business architecture team that you have the appropriate skills to do business architecture and you can then float people around to different areas of the business? Or do you find that it's more important to really have that in-depth business knowledge and people should really specialize on a particular subsection of the business rather than moving back and forth across different areas?
Want me to start on that one, Bill? Yeah, and I'll let you jump in. So I think where we see a lot of strength in teams is where they have a collection of different types of skills and personalities. So we see teams that have someone that may have come over from the business side that has a stronger business knowledge and perspective, but then they've gotten skilled as an architect and they have a structured thinking to the way they work. And then we've seen people who have more of an architecture perspective and then they learn some of the business as they go. So I would just say be open to the fact that different types of people make a strong team. Now, the question of whether or not, the domain, I'm going to use the word domain, subject matter expertise here, is also a really fundamental one. And, what I've seen over the years is companies migrate different ways. And I think at the end of the day, some of it depends on your organization. Now, I've worked in some organizations where if the business architects didn't work in the business units, at least in the beginning, they didn't get the respect and acceptance and the closeness to the business that they needed for adoption, while on the other side, I've seen organizations where the business architects didn't have that domain knowledge, but they leveraged it and the organization appreciated it because they could have a truly objective and enterprise perspective versus, maybe being tainted by a business unit. So, I don't mean to give an it depends answer, but I think the power is in the collection in doing what's right for an organization. So Bill, I'll let you add on to that.
Well, the only thing I would add is if you are lucky enough to have subject matter experts in the business who also have unique skills, and I was lucky enough to be on a great business architecture team at one point where we had two or three business meetings. One was an electrical engineer who was just absolutely brilliant with value stream mapping and driving that down to routing maps. If you don't know what those are, you can look them up in the guild. And another guy who was just excellent with vocabulary and terminology and structured thinking, and he sort of led the whole capability mapping exercise and effort. So it was a very fortunate set of cross-section of skills, and those folks happened to work in the business, and they were business subject matter experts as well. So that's a very fortunate thing to have when you have something like that.
Great, thank you. All right, next question. Are there any industry standard frameworks to create or develop business architecture that you would recommend?
Well, we did point to an approach, a framework that comes out of the BizBot guide, and that's the ones Whynde and I have been using for a very, very long time, and what many other people who are doing what I call structured business architecture, not just sort of random acts of stuff that they might call business architecture, but structured business architecture, formal business architecture. That framework that we outlined provides you with the drill down necessary to build your mappings and cross mappings and to get very, very detailed, well beyond maybe anything you've even imagined in terms of a business drill down, in terms of things like where do outcomes and value propositions and value items and how do all those pieces fit together. Very formal and continues to evolve, by the way, at that more nuanced level. If you're looking for any industry reference models, which also come up, like what if I'm in, for example, healthcare or financial services, the Business Architecture Guild also has collaborative teams that work on industry reference models as well. So I'm not trying to do an ad for the Guild. It's a fellow association, and we certainly are happy to be here with AEA today. But you know, there's also reference model teams that are working. In fact, Wendy's mentoring one of the teams on the manufacturing team, but there's several industry reference model teams who are working to build out what we call starting point maps for different sectors. Wendy?
Yeah, I think it's also good to point out that the BizBoc and the Guild has spent a lot of time working through integration points with other people as well. So, for example, we put a lot of energy into how business architecture fits with business process management, to the extent that we had someone from the BPM community co-writing content and reaching out and doing a very extensive review with that BPM community. And we did the same thing for requirements and Agile. So we do see ourselves as a bigger ecosystem, and you'll see that reflected in the BizBoc as well as corresponding white papers.
Well, I think that's a great transition to our next question, which I think is probably going to need to be the last one so we can get on to our next topic. But Riaz has a question of TOGAF, TOGAF's ADM, business artifacts are not very strong or business-oriented, not nearly as strong as the BizBoc is. Is there a push in your work to contribute to strengthening that out with BizBoc knowledge for the next release of TOGAF? Are you bringing those two bodies of knowledge together?
That's a multi-part answer, but I'll try to roll. First of all, the BizBoc itself has a TOGAF alignment section back in 6.2. And what that provides is if I am in an organization that's adopted TOGAF for enterprise architecture and I want to do business architecture using the BizBoc framework and approach, I have a set of guidelines on how to align those so that I have the best of all worlds. That's the first part of the answer. The second part of the answer is that the Guild has a team of people who are open group members. And by the way, the Guild itself will be formally joining the open group in short order. But there's a team of people within the Guild who are also open group members who are sitting on a standards review for the business architecture standard being done internally at Open Group. And then the third part of that answer is some of those same team members have been working on building out capability mapping and value mapping perspectives to target a future version of TOGAF. And all those team members are using business architecture perspectives that are derived directly out of the BizBoc. So through those participatory efforts of those organizations, we are basically incorporating Guild approaches into future versions of both standards coming out of there as well as TOGAF. Now, that's a long process, and some of this may not be obviously totally, obviously open to everybody to understand or see. But those are the three things going on, and the Guild is very active in that effort.
Great. Bill, Wendy, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us tonight. This has been incredibly eye-opening and very useful. So wanted to thank you for that. And with that, I think we're going to hand the presentation over to Riaz. And Riaz, I'm going to unmute you, and we'll mute Bill and Wendy. You want to go ahead and say something? Riaz, we're not hearing you. I know Riaz is out there because we've been getting chat messages from him. Riaz? All right, well, I think we must be having a problem with the audio here. So while we're giving Riaz a second to figure that out, Tom, are you out there?
Yes, I'm here.
All right, Tom, do you want to go ahead and go next, and we'll let Riaz close us out this evening?
Sure, no problem.
Great. So I'll pass the presenter access over to Tom, and while he's getting himself set up to present, I do want to introduce everyone to Tom Strevey. Tom is the business architecture leader at Boeing. He's been at Boeing for a fairly significant period of time and really has been contributing to driving Boeing's business strategy and functional expertise over a period of at least it looks like 11 years. I don't know if it's a lifetime for you there, Tom, or what. But without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Tom.
All right. Thank you, Mike. Can you guys see my screen okay here?
Yes.
Okay, good. So let's see. What I'll do is I'll share a little bit about what's going on in Boeing relative to business architecture, and kind of give you a perspective that's a little bit different from what you've heard before, because this is about actually the process of applying and executing business architecture. So I'll talk a little bit about challenges we've had, things we've done to move forward, and you know, some of the stuff that Bill talked about earlier kind of applied, and so I'll bring and touch on some of those aspects as we go forward. Let me see if I can go forward on my screen here. A little bit about myself. I've been working in the architecture space around the enterprise architecture for 25 years or so. I've been working at the Boeing company for 30. And really I've had a business emphasis relative to architecture for, I'd say, a majority of all of my career. So the Boeing business, from my standpoint in Boeing, I've been asked to stand up enterprise business architecture in Boeing and the business architecture practice across the company enterprise-wide. So that's part of my job that I have here in the company, to really get that established and in place. There's definitely some challenges when you've been given that task. I'll talk about some of those tonight. I'm also a fellowship member at the Boeing company. I'm a guild member that Bill leads, and I'm also represent Boeing in a Fortune 500 company, Fortune 500 Business Architecture Roundtable, where we get together and really talk about some of the key aspects and key activities that are happening around business architecture, the challenges we have from a business perspective, what works, what doesn't work, and how we're actually moving forward. And I've spoken at several conferences, really too many to list, and so I just listed a few of them there. But so I've been in the business architecture space for quite some time, been involved in major multi-billion-dollar re-engineering efforts across the company, and have a lot of experience from that standpoint. So a little bit about Boeing, for those of you that know the word and see the airplanes flying around. Boeing is a lot more and involved in quite a bit more than just airplanes. We have a total revenue of over $90 billion, and so 70% of the revenue right now is coming out of the commercial aspect, or the commercial side of the business. We do have quite an extensive footprint in the military side of the business too. The manufacturer service and technology partnerships we have around the world are with over 21,000 suppliers and partners globally, so definitely Boeing is a global company. And with that global footprint comes the wonderful aspect of different cultures globally, outside the company and inside the company. So you think about diversity in the workforce, Boeing definitely has that one covered. We do have a lot of emphasis on research and design and technology in our development centers. And those are located in multiple programs and in multiple countries, and so we leverage a lot of abilities across our enterprise. And there's more than 165,000 Boeing employees in more than 65 countries. So with that kind of a footprint, yes, you start thinking about really how do you start working and integrating and providing the tactical advantage that business architecture brings? And so getting everybody going on the same direction, the same page, sometimes can be challenging. And so let me talk a little bit about the efforts that I've really seen and really learned about standing up business architecture. And I've been in the process of putting together and establishing a business architecture presence and basically movement inside Boeing for the last about 3.5 years or so. So it hasn't been one of those things that you magically walk in one day and order everybody, gee, here's business architecture and we're showing up. It becomes really what I've learned and what I've heard again and again, not just within Boeing, but with a lot of the different companies across industry I've talked to. If you don't get quick wins, then you're not going to be successful. And that's really the long and the short of it. The management has especially senior management, has a pretty short attention when it comes to the benefit you bring if you can't prove the benefit. And so having short wins and quick wins really does make a huge difference as far as establishing and seeing the benefits of business architecture. I think the old statement of show me, right, and I'll believe it, is really true when you start talking about business architecture. It's something new and not established. It's not something that is like, gee, project management and program management, that's pretty well established and people understand the benefit and what that brings. Business architecture is one of those new animals that comes out, and people kind of look at it and squint their eyes at it and they go, well, is that kind of like enterprise architecture, or is that like those IT guys, is that something new that they dreamed up as a way to kind of get their legs into the business? So getting the quick wins and showing the benefit of it is absolutely critical. And from my experience, that's been very important as we go forward in this company. So that's one of the major points I'd share. The second thing is business architecture is not IT architecture. And so that is, I think, a big message that we've seen. I've seen a lot of times when business architecture is assumed as part of IT architecture, and as a result, people just treat it like IT architecture. And then when the business gets involved, I've seen a lot of places where there's a confrontational relationship that's established. Well, that's not my realm, and so what happens is you get this confrontational aspect going on. If I'm not leading it, then it doesn't count. And so that kind of confrontational relationship destroys the effort of establishing a business architecture practice. And it depends on the company, because I guess came up is as well, should business architecture be part of IT architecture? And I think that really depends on the company. If your company builds software and that's the business of your company, then you could probably have an integrated picture that shows that would probably work. But if your company is not that, and it's a strong manufacturing company, very much like Boeing, having business architecture integrated with IT architecture starts undermining some of the elements that I'll talk about shortly. But so that's really something that's very important to understand is really how does business architecture fit? From what I've seen, depending on the company, when I talk to the different companies, sometimes you have a situation where they stand up a business architecture practice, and guess what? It's a corner office that's sitting over there in the corner of the IT world. Nobody walks into the office. But there's a couple guys standing over there, and they're business architects. And sure enough, when they get behind on something or they need somebody to come in and speak for the business, they get a call. And so that's obviously not the ideal structure for business architecture. But I've seen some cases in the company where that's, or within companies where that's really actually the case. So the next thing is it's all about building trust with leadership. If you don't have trust, it's not going to happen. So you might have a CIO or maybe a senior IT manager or a senior manager decide, you know, let's go start up a business architecture structure. Well, that might be good, but if that manager has not established trust, or the business architects within that don't have a trust relationship with some of the other leaders, then that's going to undermine your effort. So building relationships and your network is probably the biggest plus I'd say you have to have. If you don't work your relationships and work your network, then you really won't, the quick wins won't come, the collaborative environment doesn't come, and really it starts undermining the efforts to be able to stand up business architecture. Really, really, really big deals. So all these things I talk about are things that I've seen places where they've turned around and had combative relationships or confrontational relationships and seen the results. It's not good. It just doesn't go forward. So trust, I think, is probably the most critical thing that you got to build. If you don't have the trust, you're not going anywhere. And just one leader can kill your efforts. All it takes is one to turn around and start the rumor mill, and that causes some problems. And you'll be spending all your time trying to address what that leader is doing. And sometimes you won't know what they're doing because they're doing it behind the scenes. So it's really important that you build the trust, you have the network, and you have everybody on board. That's really, really big. If you don't have that, then what's going to happen is you're going to have a floundering business architecture practice as you stand up and move forward. Probably the last one that I see, or close to the last one, that's probably the biggest, and I'd say is the biggest must you should have, is support from the C-suite. And when I say the C-suite, that's usually officers of the corporation that lead the company, the CEO and his supports. If you don't have their sponsorship, number one, you're not going to get your foot in the door when they're talking about strategy. And if you don't have your foot in the door to talk about strategy, then all the discussion Bill was talking about the key part of business architecture is connecting strategy with all the other business artifacts, and making that happen will never come true. So having your foot in the door when they're talking about strategy is so, so important for a business architect. And if you don't have that trust established and you don't have the connection with the C-suite, I don't care what you do, you're not going to get into the room where they're going to talk about strategy. And if you're not going to get into the room where you're talking about strategy, well, yep, you can build business architecture outside of the room, but if it's not in the room, it's not going to make a big impact on the company. And that's really the reason you're doing it, is because you need to have an effort, have an impact on the company that's a positive impact. That's what it's all about, and building those benefits and bringing them together. And if you're not there, boy, you've kind of lost before you started. So that's really important. And trust doesn't happen immediately. Getting that sponsorship doesn't happen immediately. But it gets to the point where as you go through and you're starting to build up a business architecture structure, there needs to be a point in time when you sit there and say, either we're making success and we're going forward, or we ought to wrap up, fold up the tent and go home. And it really gets to be very important that you evaluate that, even as you go. There's one thing that I didn't put on here that I think is one of the assessments that we do on a regular basis, and it's a really popular thing that we go through. And what it is as we go through and build up our business architecture, and we've been working on this for several years now, is we turn around and we say, what's the value proposition that we're satisfying? And we keep on asking ourselves that. And the reason is as we go through, if you don't add value to the company, then you really need to start looking at it and figuring out what it is that you need to change to add value to the company. That becomes a really important point. And so as we go through and we're doing this assessment, we're always balancing what we have, and are we adding value, are we not adding value, and what is it that we can change, or what is it that we need to do to really bring value to the company. And really, it address that first bullet about quick wins. The other thing that came up was as we started, as I said, a few years ago, I got named as a business architect, and they said, you need to go figure out what it is that we need to do to stand up business architecture in the Boeing company. And at that point in time, the person that talked to me about it was reported to the COO of the company. And so from that aspect, I went, well, good, that second to the last bullet was a nice check mark to be able to say, yep, so we have the connection from the C-suite. And so as I moved forward, then I started scratching my head and trying to answer the question, well, what makes a good business architect? And I think this was a question that was asked earlier, and about, hey, you know, is a good business architect somebody that comes from business, somebody that comes from IT? Really, where is it that they come from? And I think that probably the biggest lesson I learned about what makes a good business architect is, number one, they need to be somebody that's good at building relationships and networking. That's really important. They have to be somebody that has a technical skill and the ability to see big pictures. That's really, really important. If you can't see the big picture and you're an analytical person that gets into the details really, really fast, man, you're going to lose people before you even start. And I've seen that happen. I had a couple people that wanted to be business architect, and we started going through the detail, and man, they'd start driving into the detail, and you know, it doesn't take long before you get to the point where you're in too much detail and you're not getting your message across. You're overwhelming the audience with just too much detail. And although the detail might be accurate, might be correct, that's not the point of business architecture. It's not the point. The point isn't about going in there and showing a whole bunch of models that only you can understand. You lost the game if that's what you did. It's about bringing in something that's meaningful that people can understand and people can make good business judgments from it. That's what it's all about. And so, so when it comes down to the skills and abilities, what I've found is typically good business architects don't come from IT. I mean, unless they've worked outside of IT, and then after they've spent some time outside IT, then they went and worked in IT, and then they have this business background. I do have a couple business architects that did come from IT, but they did spend at least a quarter, if not half of their career outside of IT working in the business. So definitely that's important. I have a bunch of business architects that came from the business, but then I had to really run them through an exposure of what business architecture is, and also kind of an overview of here's IT. I think the best business architects I have are the business architects that have gone and they've worked in the business, but at the same time they've gone out and got education in what enterprise architecture means. So they have a strong appreciation for IT, how it works, how enterprise architecture works, but at the same time they have a really grounded understanding of the business. I think that's the best connection. I have a couple senior architects that have that kind of exposure, and they also have MBAs, and they do have the credibility that connects with the senior leaders, and that's really a big plus. So that's really what I see. I think really the key thing about it is the knowledge, skills, and abilities. I've seen it come from several different places. I have one guy that's a business architect that has a systems engineering degree. And so he worked as a systems engineer, and he's a darn good business architect. And so, you know, they all come from different directions and different spaces. I think one of the key things that I'd say is they all have good ability to build relationships. They're not fixated in their position. They're willing to turn around and adjust and change as needed to meet the situation and the needs. And they all have a really, really good sense of diverse culture, knowing when to speak and when to shut up. I think it's hard to find somebody. I don't think there's a single class out there or a single thing that tells you when's the critical time to speak and when's the critical time to shut up, but it seems like that's a really, really good skill. And it's not something that's just magically taught. It's something that comes through experience, I think. So that's what I've seen as far as standing up the business architecture practice. All really, really critical points, and all really, really important points as you get started. Probably the big thing in the business artifacts is I've broken them down into 4 major areas. And we talk about the strategy and getting the strategy elements together. And a lot of these pictures you've seen are pretty much standard pictures, and there's nothing really unique about it. But when you start building strategies and building operations and having the organization and the transformation, you can see in the middle capability map. Bill talked about capability maps. And in the Boeing company, we do have capability maps that we do leverage, and we do have a pretty extensive integration of the capability maps. I believe at this point in time there's not a leader in this company that does not understand what a capability map is and what a capability is. And for a company that has such a broad, diverse group as we do, that's a pretty big win, I think. From that standpoint, is at least they understand and appreciate what it means. The linkage of that and making it connecting the strategy with the operations and that aspect, that's all in play. There's different elements of it that provide value and don't provide value. I think probably the biggest lesson that I've learned over this last year is one of don't create artifacts for artifacts' sake. And that's really, it gets too easy to get caught into that. You can actually start marching down and you can see, I mean, there's over, I think there's pretty close to 50, there's 54 or 55 artifacts within the scope of business architecture that you can go build, that go build a complete structure within business architecture. And all of them have different purposes, different reasons for being, and different uses and different applications. That's where they are. The challenge gets to be is knowing which ones to apply when. And so when you're dealing with some specific people that have, want to see some of the strategy elements and how it really works, that really gets to be really important. And pulling up a heat map of something can really be powerful depending on the situation. And so really what I've seen is what's really important is not just the ability to create these artifacts, but also knowing when to create the artifacts. One question that comes up is business architecture as a discipline is extremely broad. I mean, you look at some of the stuff that we shared earlier tonight that Bill shared, really starts getting into the details about how broad business architecture is and how many places of the business can really reach into, from an organizational aspect, from a strategic aspect, from a business model aspect. There's so many places where you can look at and say, wow, it really does have an influence, have an impact on that. So what I've seen is you won't find anybody that has all the skills and abilities to do all of it. What you will find is you will find people that have specific abilities in certain areas. And what's important is you're building your team, having a structure of saying, I have people that are great at strategy. And my experience is people that are good at strategy suck at transformation. And people that are good at an organization are okay at operations, but not always the best. So having a mix and having the right structure is really critical. So that's I guess what I see. So with that, I guess that's kind of the highlights I wanted to provide. I know that I could probably go into more detail, but I wanted to give some time for some question and answer and give people an opportunity to kind of ask and see if there's any questions they have, or I just bored them to tears, or what have you.
So we haven't seen a lot of questions come in on the chat. So if folks have questions, please go ahead and send those in on the chat. I can tell you, Tom, that the feedback that we've gotten on the chat is that your presentation was very good, very insightful. And I can definitely second that from my own personal experience and what you're sharing. I think your insights have been very valuable for us. But are there any other questions that folks have about the perspective that Tom's been sharing tonight? Feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself and jump in, or send those into the chat. Looks like we got a question from Chandra in the chat. Are there any examples of quick wins that you could share with us?
Yeah, I think there are. I think probably the biggest example I see of a quick win is we had a situation where we had we were going through the process of a portfolio exercise, and in this case we had a structure where we turned around and we were really evaluating where does it make sense to be spending the money, and where are we going to benefit the most. What we had done is we had built a capability map, and then what we did is we started doing the analysis of aligning what our portfolio was aligned to the capability map. And what it did is with that, then we started doing a competitive analysis of which capabilities really we have a competitive advantage in. And one of the big things that did is that really highlighted where we were spending our resources versus where we really had identified where we have a competitive advantage. And that really resulted in really a reassessment by some of our leaders to say, well, wait a minute, boy, we really ought to rethink this. And so I'd say that was a real quick win, because it really provided them insight to understand and know really where they ought to be applying that. And one of the things that I look at as a indication of success of that is that from that activity we have then now transformed the point to where a large percentage of the work we do relative to that analysis, we do include a competitive advantage analysis with the capability map when we're doing our portfolio assessments. So that really is a great indication of we did have a good win, and it did translate into wider use of business architecture.
Great. I'm gonna combine the next two questions. You talked about the importance of having C-level support for your work. So can you talk a little bit about how you went about achieving that, and in particular focus, what are some of the sales and marketing techniques you used as you were trying to turn some of the folks that might have been skeptical into partners and advocates for your work?
Okay, so that's a great question. Two great questions. First part of it was as part of the structure of the C-level support. Really, what's interesting is the effort to get C-level support. Interestingly enough, did not start when I was named a business architect. It started 5 years prior to that, and so during that time, there was some work being done within enterprise architecture, and I made a point of saying, you know, you guys are marching along with enterprise architecture and you don't have a business perspective. You really have to have a business perspective. And they agreed that made a lot of sense. And through the process of really building that business perspective, I started getting higher level and higher level visibility of what the importance was and how that worked. And so it wasn't a quick, oh, I ran into this executive, in the elevator or anything like that. Although I did have that happen when I was traveling. I ended up sharing a taxi with the CFO. And so that was kind of an interesting and unique experience. But you do have opportunities like that come. But the fundamental thing was to build the support was something that really I had to build it up from the base up. I got sponsorship from the CIO and from the CTO as far as really understanding and getting that breadth. Currently, we have sponsorship from the CEO right now, so that's you can't really get much higher sponsorship than that. Let's see, the second question, what was the second question again?
It was just about some of the techniques that you use
to
convert people.
Yeah, I'll tell you, that's kind of a hard one. First of all, you get kind of a couple different people. Some people that turn around and, by golly, no matter what you do, they're not going to change their mind. Man, they're just like their feet are set in stone. And the best thing to do is to recognize when that happens and move on. I mean, that's really, because you're not going to change them. That's the way they're going to be. The second thing is, I brought up on my slide this business of trust and building trust. And for some people, to be able to transition that is for them to see you actually do something for them that really benefits them and provides value to them. And so from that aspect, it really becomes knowing what business architecture artifact we could generate that would really be a benefit to them, and then they usually see the benefit and they will line up and support you. So it's all about building that trust, and if you haven't built that trust, then they're not going to be on your side. So I'd say focus on trust. There's a couple books out there, The Triangle Trust, or The Speed of Trust, Stephen Covey. Those are good books, and I'd say if you haven't read them, go read them, because by golly, what they have in them is very true. You got to really focus on the trust.
Very good. Well, I think that we covered all the questions. So I want to thank you, Tom, very much for sharing your perspective. It was very insightful and much appreciated. And with that, I think we're going to try and turn it over to Riaz. Riaz, let's try the audio this time and see if we're any better.
Can you hear me this time?
I think we got you this time.
Good, good.
Very good. So thanks again, Riaz, for joining us for the conversation here tonight. And I want to introduce all of you to Riaz. Riaz is a part of the enterprise architecture and digital transformation practice at Ernst & Young. In fact, he's the practice leader. Riaz is also an instructor in enterprise architecture at the University of Toronto. He has a lengthy set of experiences in enterprise architecture and business architecture at companies like Oracle and Sears Canada and Royal Bank of Canada and IBM. And so we're very, very blessed to be able to have Riaz and welcome Riaz to the stage. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Riaz.
Thanks. Can you guys see the PowerPoint that I'm sharing?
Yes.
Great. Okay, I'm going to put it in full screen mode. Sometimes it screws things up, so if it does, let me know. Can you still see it?
We are still seeing the not the full screen mode, but the others. Okay,
I'll see what I can do in terms of switching it over. Let's see here. Share your screen. You have the slides as well, right? If you want to line it up, we could do that, or I'll just continue here with these slides. If everyone can read them, I'll just walk through them. Is it legible on the other end?
Right now, what we're seeing is your desktop in your car.
Oh, okay. Let's switch this back over.
We'll give you one more second, and I've got it pulled up here. We can.
Yeah. Are we back to the PowerPoint?
we're back to the PowerPoint and the main view of it, not the presentation view.
Okay, yeah, it seems like if I throw in presentation view, it's going to throw it to another monitor, and then the screen show gets all messed up. So I'll use the this view for now. Assuming everyone can read it, I'll make it a little bigger. Can everybody read that out?
Yep.
Great. Okay, so thanks for the introduction. As was said, I've been across multiple organizations, IBM and EY sort of bookending the start and sort of, I guess, midpoints of my career. In between there, I spent some time at Royal Bank, and I was going to highlight a little bit of Royal Bank of Canada. So I've been all over Canada and parts of the U.S. in terms of doing consulting. Royal Bank of Canada has a really great business architecture program that they've established at least 10 years ago. So maybe sometime in the future we may want to invite them to present. Sears Canada, in the last 7-8 months I was over there, and could do maybe a bit of a case study on when you try to do enterprise architecture without business architecture, and specifically what happens and some of the pitfalls there. So that's the last little bit of my career. Currently I'm working at a Canadian bank, one of the top 5 Canadian banks, and they're actually rebooting their enterprise architecture practice. This was a mandate that came down from the co-CIOs. They realized that, obviously banking is going through a major transformation right now in terms of fintechs eating up the value chain, foreign banks moving into Canada in a larger scale fashion, and the leadership of the bank realizing to be able to execute a transformation effectively and efficiently, they need a strong enterprise architecture practice, including all the domains that we talked about earlier today. So I'm working on that currently. So I'll just sort of jump in. Most of these slides are EY's perspective on enterprise architecture. Start a little bit with a little bit of the marketplace reaction when we go out and we talk to clients, and what we hear in terms of why clients, particularly the C-suite, why they want to pursue architecture. So they all agree that we need enterprise architecture in their enterprise, but they come at it from various points of view. So I've seen points of view historically around, well, we need compliance, we need standards. The enterprise architecture group is a great place to sort of anchor that capability. So let's pursue, building out the EA practices, sort of a focal point around that. But it's more of a historical thing. What I'm seeing now as I go across different clients in Canada is more of a focus on EA being a focal point for enablement. So how does EA help accelerate the speed of the business? How does EA help with hyperspeed IT? And that's a bit of a move away from the old come up with standards and then enforce them through a whole bunch of governance bodies, to be more of an enabler relative to producing reusable artifacts. So we talked earlier about reference architectures, business capabilities, business principles, standards, and having the EA team actually generate those reusable assets and communicate them across the enterprise. So I'm seeing more of a focus around that and less of a focus around governance these days. And finally, hearing a lot about, well, still we need business IT alignment. It's not a surprise to everybody on the call that year over year we see IT budgets shrinking. At Sears in the last year, our budget went from 100 million to 50 million to 14 million just before I left, and that's in a company that's folding up. But at other companies that are still doing well, they still see decreases in their IT budget year over year. So in that scenario, you can't afford to be inefficient with your use of IT efforts, and enterprise architecture done properly will help to mitigate that. So I'll just move on here. So in terms of business architecture and why do you need an architecture? So this canonical example that we see over and over again, and it's sort of reused to death, is the example of a skyscraper. And would you build a skyscraper without architecture? And obviously not. The issue with comparing this with enterprise architecture is that a building is relatively static over its lifetime, whereas an enterprise is certainly dynamic and fluid. And so, as you're building out, say, this skyscraper and you get up 2/3 of the way up, you wouldn't expect one of your key stakeholders to come in and say, hey, I want to have a jetway that goes across from this skyscraper to the skyscraper that's adjacent to it with a swimming pool attached, and have it, opaques, or so you can actually, swim around and have a great time in it. But in enterprises, particularly with requests to the IT function, you see those types of requests come all the time. And how can you facilitate those types of requests without having a structured architecture process that helps you to respond? So that's a bit of the sort of analogy we make here. In the previous discussions, we talked about, you start with the business model and the business strategy. You decompose that into an operating model, and then finally get down into a capability model, and then mapping into the different domains of architecture. This one is a little bit of a spin on that spaghetti integration chart that you must have seen in the last several years. On the left-hand side, it talks about what's an enterprise look like if you don't have any discipline in architecture. Enterprise architecture, any of the domains. You have a collection of projects that are sort of spewing together. You have no clear end date. You have no clear success criteria. So you always see, as a classical example of the never-ending project. Underneath those projects, you have redundant systems, redundant processes. You have scope creep with the requirements that just seem to just bloat and bloat over a period of time. And then you have integration nightmares as new requirements come up, and you have to integrate various systems, and there's no sort of integration architecture that supports that. So what happens with that? You end up having a fatigued enterprise. On the right-hand side, we talk a little bit about architecture-based approach, and it's not a panacea, but it does definitely solve a lot of the issues or reduce a lot of the complexity you have when you're building out your architecture across your enterprise. One of the key points I like to point out here is talking about traceability, right? So what's the traceability between these IT solutions, programs, projects, up to the requirements that are handed across from the business, and more importantly, up to the capabilities and the business strategies. So if you have a capability that is now becoming more important to the business, for example, Royal Bank of Canada deciding that in Asia Pacific they want to increase their presence in wealth management, well, what are the capabilities that support that initiative? And what are the underlying systems and processes and data and information, and what does it look like? What shapes it in? So you're going to put more investment into that than you would put into, for example, it was in the press last week that Royal Bank again divested pieces of their insurance business to Aviva Canada. So if that doesn't happen overnight, and over a period of time you sort of look at your portfolio of businesses in a large business and realize, like, hey, it's like in the Jack Welch philosophy, if I can't be one or two, I'll get out of the business. So why would you continue to spend IT dollars in that area if it's not, that capability is not strategic to the ongoing roadmap of the business? So a little bit of color commentary on these two ways of operating a business. So in terms of how do we get it right? So right now, for example, I'm in at that other Canadian bank, and we're bringing in a full-blown reboot of their EA program, including bringing in new metrics, bringing in a methodology. We're starting with TOGAF, but we're augmenting it heavily with principles and artifacts and guidelines from BizBock. We're defining governance models. We're defining skills and roadmaps for development of architects, but that's all prefaced on having strong leadership and sponsorship of the initiative, and we have that from the CIO, the co-CIOs. The box on the right here relative to metric alignment, the VP who's a sponsor here, one thing he said continuously over the last 4 weeks is I want to focus on the stakeholder metrics, so basically up to the CIOs and SVPs, and I want to get those right, and I want to make sure they're business focused, and then we will reverse engineer the program behind that. So I thought that's a, it's an enlightened way of thinking, because many times you'll see in organizations they do architecture for the sake of architects, and sometimes architecture for the sake of IT, but architecture, just like other functions within IT, is a supporting function within a business, right? And so if you are not driving value to your stakeholders and you don't know how to measure that and quantify it, you'll have the classic blips of investment where there's big, push, you bring in EAs, you bring in tools and techniques and the rest, and then over a period of 3 years, 4 years, you see that the interest dissipates, people become cynical, and you see it die on the vine. Focusing on the metrics and the accountability is a great way of preventing that, or at least preventing that from really going down. So getting into a little bit of the approach here. A lot of this will sort of echo what you've heard previously, but you really have to start with the business model, right? What is the business, and why is it moving in a particular direction? What's the external market forces on it, and how is it articulated? Finally, from that, you decompose it into an operating model, capability model, which we talked about earlier, and then you have traceability into the various disciplines in architecture. At the very end, you have to operationalize this, so you have to build out a roadmap, a transformation roadmap. When do you do which projects in what sequence of time? What's the benefit realization of those projects, and what are the dependencies between them? So in terms of business model, I'm not sure how many people are familiar with this this concept. It's the business model canvas by Alexander Osterwalder. And I think it's fantastic. It's a great way to pictorially represent a business. You can do it in a very lightweight process, and when I say lightweight, I mean lightweight, like a whiteboard with post-it notes and markers, and then using cameras to take pictures and compare one model versus another. Mark had mentioned that I teach enterprise architecture at University of Toronto. We used business model canvas for the case study to compare airlines. So it's a great way to sort of start, and it's not notationally heavy, so a business executive can understand this. Then this is an example of comparing, the maturity along these different components in the business model with two airlines, actually. So EasyJet, which is more like Southwest Airlines, and a conventional carrier like American. And as you can see in the spider graph, it's a very different focus, right? And it should be that way. Then drilling down from the model, once you have your business model, drilling down into the operating model. So this is an approach that was highlighted by Jeannie Ross at MIT CISR. It's a book called Enterprise Architecture: A Strategy, which if you haven't read it, really strongly recommend it. It's one of those classical textbooks of enterprise architecture, and it really talks about how does EA support strategy and development through an organization. And she has, as part of that book, this quad chart that talks about the different sort of modes a business can be in, right? So you could be in coordination, unification, replication, or diversification. So it gives examples of these, like for example, diversification type companies are like holding companies. Again, I'm in Canada, so I'll use a Canadian example. D&H is a holding type company. But then you have other companies that are a little more tightly integrated, right? So for example, Royal Bank of Canada is a highly centralized financial services company. So if you take a look at these different modes of operating, how would it affect the business model? Right, and how would it affect, standardization of processes and things like that? So this is another sort of technique to use to decompose from the business model down to lower levels. So a little bit on, when you do baseline and target, examples of industries where they go through transformation, such as like financial services or even retail. You may start off in one way. Like for example, a diversified type company that just grew through acquisition, and then you're moving to more of a unified company over time, but it takes time. So, how do you track for that and manage for that? Business capability, we talked about earlier, prior to the business capability, you have to really have the strategy articulated well, and that's in terms of drivers, goals, and objectives. assuming that's done in a way that's digestible and understandable by the business architects, then you get to the business capabilities. And yesterday, actually, I was out at Robank. I was talking to a friend of mine who just got promoted to head of business architecture, and I asked him, hey, what's changed in the last 5-6 years since I've been there? And at that time, I still thought it was one of the strongest business architecture practices at a client in Canada. And what he told me was they have sort of repurposed their spend of time from business capability modeling and business capability mapping to higher up the value chain into strategy articulation and strategy mapping, so that the inputs into the business architecture, which are the strategies from the lines of business, are well formulated. And as he said to me, it's garbage in, garbage out. If you get really poor, vaguely defined business strategies, your business capability models can't be that strong. So as someone mentioned earlier in the presentations today, you have to have your foot in the door of the strategy. So if you're sitting outside and you're developing capabilities and the rest, but you're doing it independent of what's going on relative to the strategy in the business, you're probably producing something that might not be very usable. And finally, once you have that, and it's a bit of a leap here to jump from the capability model all the way down to technology and applications, but you decompose that business capability model down into maybe sub-capabilities, processes, and then finally a mapping to IT. So this is a little bit of an example of a heat map. Once you get your capability model down, you can start using different ways to sort of classify, which areas to focus. You can have different sort of parameters that you'll sort of focus on. For example, risk, cost, security, innovation, and you can figure out which capabilities to then do a drill down on. And finally, using architecture to provide traceability. So, a big part of having a well-oiled architectural machine is not just producing the artifacts and being able to explain them, but being able to provide traceability forwards and backwards through, your architecture practice. So top down from, the value chain to the business capabilities, the sub-capabilities to the processes, and then the underlying IT domains like the information and applications and technology that are used, but also the other way around. And it's useful because when you're looking again at prioritizing IT spend, you may have a business critical capability that's supported by information that's poorly defined, poorly managed, not secured well, on an application that's written in a language that very, very few still understand, and they're probably, maybe moving on to retirement, moving to the Bahamas, on very brittle technology. Does that make sense? Doesn't make sense. And conversely, having very expensive, technology and brand new applications supporting a business function that you're about to, or capability you're about to divest, doesn't make sense either. So having the traceability really helps in that regard. So moving into the last section here. So, what are we hearing at a high level at EY from different sort of components in terms of our clients, right? So in terms of, the very top from the CEO, what are we hearing? So we're hearing things like, I need a simple way to communicate strategy and to get business units marching to the same beat. Business architecture obviously helps with that. I'm hearing, we hear things a lot, particularly across retail and financial services, about omni-channel strategies, and rolling out an omni-channel program across a large organization is a complex endeavor, and without having a strong business architecture capability, again, it's a relatively inefficient process. And then the last one, which I touched on the previous slide, how do I the board that I'm using technologies to improve operations? Business architecture, again, helps with that. These ones you've probably seen a million times. The CFO, again, it's about costs, being able to understand the mix of the budget and why things are being done in that particular way. Another example is the consolidation of financial data takes too long, and there's manual intervention, things like that. I was surprised to find out at a major Canadian bank, their business processes were so brittle in terms of being able to do financial reporting at quarter end that it was just by luck and heroics that they would get out their quarterly reports to Bay Street. So we ended up having a process architecture review, and we came up with sort of a 2B process that was a lot more, what's the word I'm looking for, resilient and efficient. Finally, in terms of the CIO, and obviously this is something that I experienced over at Sears, how does she manage her IT department in terms of predictability and efficiency of delivery of projects and business IT alignment? Having an enterprise architecture, and what we ended up creating actually was an enterprise transformation office where we put enterprise architecture, project management, IT risk and governance, and IT finance under one VP, which was myself. And it helped to develop synergies between those different components, because when you get into things like application portfolio management, things like that, it's really a cross-discipline type of endeavor. You need enterprise architects to help develop the roadmaps and strategies, but you also need the project managers to do the portfolio governance and business relationship type management. So this is getting a little bit into, what do architecture projects look like? At the very top, you have your value chain. You always have some sort of business design authority that helps to take a look at, the various work streams and sequence them in the right way. You have to, for major transformation projects, you should have, a governance body that helps coordinate the various activities and work streams. So it's just a bit of a high-level EY view on how you should structure architecture projects. So these are some of the deliverables, just sort of high-level examples. I think people have seen that. One thing that I've found in the last little while as I've moved around organizations is folks that try to create these deliverables and manage them with Word, PowerPoint, Excel, and SharePoint, they can get a very low level of maturity, but very quickly, it becomes something that's not manageable. Without a whole lot of metadata that you sort of tag across all these artifacts, you really can't do things like, for example, report on those metrics to the senior stakeholders. So, my recommendation would be obviously crawl, walk, and run, but when you get to walk and you've defined your core artifacts and your governance models, at that point, you really should start looking at some sort of tool to act as a repository for these things. And then finally, a little bit of discussion around TOGAF. We're seeing broad adoption of TOGAF now in the Canadian marketplace. The major Canadian banks, government, retail, including the biggest department store chain, have all standardized around TOGAF, sent their architects out to become trained in it. As I mentioned a little earlier today, there's areas in TOGAF with, the process is well defined, but when you get down to, the actual artifacts and you take a look at the templates, there's a bit to be desired, particularly in the business architecture realm. So if anyone's actually rolling out TOGAF at an enterprise, I recommend heavily augmenting the business architecture phase with stuff from BizBock. Then there's a little bit more on, why choose TOGAF and the rest, and a little bit of a sales pitch for EY. Only thing I'll mention here is that my understanding is EY is heavily sort of working with the Open Group, particularly around the business architecture stream. I believe EY was involved with the business architecture profession template that went into the architecture certification package in the last several years. So when I certified as an architect in 2007, you did not have business architecture as a discipline that you could choose. You do have that now, and it's my understanding that EY was very helpful in terms of creating that. I believe as it says here, they were vice chair on that working committee. So EY is a strong contributor to that. And that's about it. A little bit more sales pitch stuff on EY that I don't think anyone needs to really see. And I'll open up for questions.
All right, so it is just a little bit before 8. We do have just a couple minutes for a question or two. Anybody have any questions for Riaz tonight? Well, I think Riaz, you may be off the hook because I think we have sufficiently overloaded everybody's brains with the wonderful, rich presentations and conversation tonight. So I think you're off the
Okay, no
hook.
problem. I can have dinner then.
Yes, exactly. Thank you everyone for coming. We'll get the presentations and the recordings posted hopefully up fairly shortly, and we'll do this again in May. May 12th, I believe, is the date, either 11th or 12th. And thanks everyone. Talk to you soon.
Bye.